Good day, everyone. Welcome to the Inverted Orthodoxy Podcast. I am Blake. I'm here with Doug and Kyle, and we are pastors at Living Springs Church. And we are excited, like we are every week that we do this, to just get into your questions and take you on an adventure through the twists and turns of our faith. Mm-hmm. And this week we have some AER, so I think we're just going to jump right to it.
Time for accusations, explanations, and recantations.
All right. Our AER says this. I'm not sure if my previous one got through, but I listened to a podcast on theology in the raw talking about the toxic war on masculinity. And the lady in there talked about how gender roles were not subject to what we think now. Families used to work in the home together doing the family business. It was after the Industrial Revolution that men started to really work outside of the home without the rest of their families.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've taken a whole bunch of cultural things and written them back into the Bible, and always assume that's how it was. The women of even Jesus' day were very much involved in both family businesses and their own businesses. We have, according to Luke, Jesus' whole ministry is sponsored financially by the work of women and by them giving their dollars. We've got Paul, who leaned heavily on a couple of women who were of some level of status of their own. Priscilla, in particular, being one who it's assumed she was a clothing or dye merchant by her ability to navigate within the world. And then that has how most of history has worked. The marriage was not always a loving, committed partnership in like romance first, as much as it was a practical one of
survival even.
Correct, right?
Yeah.
And there was a dependency.
Not a business relationship, but it had elements of it.
Very much so. Like, we need other people, and then we need to make kids to be the hands towards our business, towards our survival. Like, there was an economic feature to every marriage, and romance probably came second, if anything, to that. Like, there's a function of we need to be together. And so for the most of history, that has been the case in more agrarian societies. And yes, the Industrial Revolution changed that, but even more so, actually, it was post-World War II that changed that even more so than the Industrial Revolution. So when we speak of the wife at home and the man going to work, that's more of a 1940s, 50s, 60s thing than it is in even like Industrial Revolution. Because we had to recorrect from the Industrial Revolution. If everybody can work outside the home, maybe we shouldn't put the kids in there. Right. Was also a recorrection we had to do, and women were in there. And then there was this protection after the Second World War that really brought just the men into more blue and white collar work than the agrarian societies and the industries attached to it.
I question that, though. I saw a thing a while back. It said in the 1900s, early 1900s, we took children out of the mines. Yep. In 2025, Minecraft is the most popular video game. Clearly, the children yearn for the mines.
There you have it. Pastor Doug Funuff. You can email him directly. He is in support of children in the mines.
No, it said the children yearn for the mines. My daughter would play Minecraft 24/7 if she could. And I just think maybe there's some truth there. No, I'm just kidding.
Were we talking about it on this podcast, or was that a conversation outside of this room where we're just saying maybe my parents' generation is the richest because they could afford to live like husband working outside the home, mother in the home, not two jobs?
Yeah, we talked about that.
Yeah,
here.
I think so. And statistically, I've now actually heard a couple times since then that the boomers starting to die off will make for the largest transfer of wealth that we've ever seen in recorded history. Wherever the boomer money goes, there's going to be much industry and wealth transferred, whether that be through inheritance to kids or through wherever the investments get placed. It's about to be the largest transfer of wealth in human history.
Yeah, because I've thought of that since whenever we had that conversation, was just thinking how even I grew up with that mentality. Like, we tried really hard in my home. We had lots of kids, and we thought it would be beneficial to have Aaron at home taking care of the kids. So we chose that. Yeah. And it was really hard, but we did navigate it. And I was thinking, I don't know that we'd get that same choice today. Like, with just, there's a difference in, or I don't think young couples have that same choice. I mean, obviously, you can always make sacrifices, but it is getting harder to live on one income, like almost impossible, I'd say, in some circumstances, right? So,
So, in this question, it says toxic war on masculinity, and I wonder if that's what it meant, or if it's meant war on toxic masculinity.
I heard it as that.
So I appreciate we were talking about in the past rich women being able to support the ministry of Christ, and Luke even recording that. I think what can get overlooked in that view is the fact that there were also tremendously oppressed women. Mm-hmm. And the difference was, if you had money, you had options.
Yeah.
And that has always been the case.
Yeah, like that's still today.
Yeah, and you see that when people talk along political lines today about helping out certain groups, different things, they will point to the exception and go, look, they don't need it. But because somebody has access to wealth or has opportunity does not mean that there's not still problems there. Yep. So you're not advocating that there were no issues in Bible times. I just want to make that clear.
Appreciate it.
The reality is that if you have money, you can live the exception to the norm.
Yeah.
And the reality is, in Bible times, there were oppressed women. Mm-hmm. In the Industrial Revolution times, there were oppressed women. In post-World War II, there were oppressed women. Yep. And today, there are oppressed women. Mm-hmm. The problem has always been and will always be humans.
Yep.
It is, we are the problem.
Yes.
This is one of the core tenets of our faith is that I am a sinner.
Yeah.
Right? And we don't want to admit that. There are people who always have something else that is the problem. A number of years ago, I think it was the New York Times did this thing, What is Wrong in the World Today? And I believe it was G.K. Chesterton who responded. They invited people to just write essays. And his was, I am. And that was the end of his essay. Yeah. Just this recognition that we are all part of the problem. Even as, if we're genuinely following Jesus, we're endeavoring to be a part of the solution. Yep. We have to recognize a part of being part of the solution is recognizing we are often part of the problem.
Yeah.
I haven't listened to this Theology in the Raw podcast specifically that they're talking about.
No.
But just as I read this question, I don't know if what is being said in that podcast was how the change in the Industrial Revolution or something else caused some of these things to emerge.
Yeah.
And while those changes certainly can create new problems, if it weren't for the problem of the human heart, we wouldn't have most of those problems.
Yes. I'm assuming the AER fits in with one of the two questions we've had regarding the roles of women in the home over the last little bit. And so I was more just thinking that has not always been the case. And when we hear, and all of us alive today have often been in cultures that have reported what it looks like to be a, air quotes for the audio-only listeners, biblical woman is drawn out of a cultural assumption from the 50s that we've inherited and tried to maintain more than a biblical one. And so this, I think AER was following back up to that has not always been the case of an economic provider is a male role that is written in by the Bible. And that has not always been the case, even just if we look back as near as World War II or even the Industrial Revolution.
I can remember, I honestly don't know the time and space, but I remember the thought process of reading Proverbs 31, I assume probably on a Mother's Day or something, and going,
classic.
Hang on, that woman does not fit with the woman that I've been taught is supposed to be.
Yeah, even though Proverbs 31 woman is the one that's held up.
We're doing it on Mother's Day. We're going to preach about this.
But we're going to. I also think that Proverbs 31 woman is a personification of wisdom.
Very much.
Yes.
So.
It is not
absolutely
this. If you hold this Proverbs 31 up woman, it's be like, that's what I want my spouse to aspire to. If you're a male, or if you're a woman, that's what I want to aspire to. You are. That person never sleeps.
No.
That person never stops working.
Yeah.
That person never rests. They never are able to enjoy life. They never are able to enjoy the fruit of their labor. They're just constantly doing more. And you read that, and I have heard specifically guys be like, oh, yeah, I would love a Proverbs 31 woman. And I'm like, you would never see her. Like, and maybe that's what you want in a wife, but I like my wife, and I like to see my wife. And we've lost sight of the fact that that is a personification of wisdom as revealed all through the book of Proverbs.
Mm-hmm. I was just mentioning the working outside the home piece, but
yeah, no, it is absolutely, and it does talk about that. She's in the marketplace, she's buying, she's selling, she's doing all of these things. 100%. That is not how we often have painted biblical womanhood.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, should we jump into our first question then?
I think so.
Kyle's excited for this one.
I'm excited for this one.
Not as excited as Kyle.
I was reading through Genesis, and I ran into the word Nephilim. Chapter 6, verse 4. I was hoping you guys could provide some background on who they are, because of the verses before and after the Bible talks about the sons and daughters of God, I can only assume they are Nephilims, or that the Nephilims are different. My assumption with quick research is that they are giants, possibly like Goliath.
Your research is accurate. This is a really important word in Jewish culture, even though we don't see it more than just one more time in even only some Bible translations. Not even all Bible translations have it a second mention. Mm-hmm. Some of them were relegated just to the one mention in Genesis chapter 6. But this carries on as an idea much further into Jewish thinking, and will later then be expanded upon in what we call the Second Temple period, what we would refer to as oftentimes, I think falsely, as the silent years, following the end of our Old Testament and the beginning of our New. It's written about there through a book in particular called Enoch. There's 4 books within the book of Enoch that are expanding on the thoughts of where this comes from. The story surrounding Genesis 6 is that there were supernatural beings and human beings who came together and made offspring that are then, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, unsanctioned creation. This then gets carried on to a whole bunch of then mythology within Jewish tradition, like Enoch, but also is common thinking in the wider world at the time. So these unsanctioned beings, if I can carry on with that word for a while, then have these incredible powers that are beyond what human limitation were. They are an attempt from the enemy in the thinking of Jewish writers and Enoch, for the enemy, for evil to kind of take control over the world. These get referred to later as the Watchers, the people who are the sons of God, the original supernatural beings who then had children with human daughters. These Watchers then came down and give humans the idea of beauty and war and technology and art in ways to influence our cultures. All of it comes out from there. So the story of Noah, the movie it got made years ago now, and everyone, evangelicals roared about, where are these Watchers coming from? And this
why
is
are there giants?
Yeah, this is crazy. You're just making stuff up. Well, actually not, if you follow Jewish tradition and thinking, though it's not common in our Bible. So that's a whole other conversation where those lines blur and how we assume those influences. So yes, these are then the line of the giants. They had physical characteristics that made them and distinguished them from humans, including their size. Other characteristics get tagged on. And so all of the ites, as I think I've referred to them easily in some of our podcasts before, they all come from all those people in the land of Canaan that we then see the conquest through Joshua. They all then have bloodlines back to the Nephilim as well, which is then a carrying on of those ideas. Some of them, like Goliath and his brothers, still maintaining the change in size, and then they get designated as giants, though not all of them seem to carry that. It's a brief overview.
Yes. I think we don't... Yes, we limit the Bible to, like there was no thought and world that shaped it.
Yep.
Right? And so we view the Bible in isolation. And we don't think about the wider thinking that fed into what became our Bible. And as a result, then there are these things that get addressed from outside of the Bible that we are either unaware of or that we are uncomfortable with. Yep. And like I think of in the New Testament, I want to say it's Jude, but I could be wrong, where it talks about the archangel Michael not even willing to say anything bad about Satan when they were arguing over the body of Moses, right? And we read that in the New Testament, and we're like, okay, so don't say anything bad about Satan. Like, we don't think about, like,
what is going on?
What are you talking about? Yeah. But that is from the Book of Enoch. Yeah. This literature that was heavily influential in that world. Yep. And that gets referenced in a letter that one Christian elder is writing to somebody else or other group of people, because I can't remember which book it is in right now. Yeah. And we don't even think about that.
Peter makes mention.
We don't question these things, and we don't think about the wider world. Yeah. And I think we shouldn't be so afraid of learning about the wider world that the Bible was written into, because it is amazing, and it brings the biblical story to life in greater and greater ways. And we've referenced this many times in the past, but I'm going to just quickly mention season 1 of the Bema podcast as a great source for specifically the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The way that they walk through and talk about some of the Jewish thinking that shaped the narrative and why these stories are in our scripture, and what they really have to say from a Jewish mindset. It's a really, really amazing thing. Yeah. So, yeah, there's so much more to, like, the worldview, the world that built the Bible. Yeah, would help us understand the Bible better if we were not so afraid to look at the world that built the Bible.
Yep. Michael Heiser, he's been mentioned many times on this podcast, but I think really helpful. His book, Supernatural, is really easy and accessible. His book, Reversing Herman, is specifically dealing with Enochian thinking and its influence on our New Testament, and even Jesus' ministry. I will not give any spoilers more than that of how Jesus addresses certain ideas within that. But also, Heiser's work is Angels and Unseen Realm and maybe Demons have all also been made into documentaries for free on YouTube.
Have they really?
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. So that's actually on our Check It Out series online. At some point, I think we just promoted it a couple weeks ago, or it's coming up. I think it's coming up this Friday. This Friday. There you go. So if you're watching this in real time, you'll see the promotion for those on those. But this is early, then I guess look at it. Those are all available for free on YouTube.
Yeah, and that's cool. Lots of stuff on YouTube and podcasts and everything about people today that are intrigued by this stuff. Yes. Trying to figure out this world, right? Yes. Like, you're going to find elongated skulls all over this planet. You're going to find giant bones, and you're going to find all the megalithic structures that, we give credit to, through the school we've been brought up in or whatever, to different, cultures and ages that these things are built. Yeah. But then you start pulling back and you go, hang on, there's stones under stones that are built way differently. Back to the idea of like the pyramids. How did they ever do this? Right. Yeah. And all that thinking. So if you want to have fun and you're intrigued by this kind of stuff, there's a lot out there that...
not that we're endorsing all the things you will run into on YouTube.
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. I'm saying there's some crazy
I know you weren't.
Stuff, right?
Just clarifying. Like, if you go on YouTube and you search for this stuff, you'll find a lot of like, yes, absolutely. But our list is much shorter than the YouTube algorithm may provide.
I mean, you can rabbit hole and get probably conspiracy. You will. Sorry, I'll rephrase that. You will find a lot of conspiracy theory that is not so good. I don't know. Yeah.
The reality is that we don't know. Yeah. And until somebody builds a time machine, we won't know.
Yeah,
and there are things that we don't understand. Yeah. And that is... Archaeology is a science that has to be approached with humility. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right? We have to do it that way because there's things that are hard to reconcile. Yeah. And but for me, and I think for you guys as well, because of the conversations we've had, I think that we all can appreciate the mystery, and and enjoy some of the wild theories out there from a purely fascinating point of view, while still going, we're just going to hold to the mystery. And the mystery means this could be a thing. Yeah. I'm not saying it is the
Correct.
thing. So,
yes. I follow somebody, I can't even remember who, on Instagram ever since I started digging into this.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, where do they keep getting the material from? Because like daily they show pictures of more megalithic stuff, right? Like the guy visited Easter Island just a couple of weeks ago, and that was kind of, and I was like, this stuff is all over our world, and I have no idea. Like I just don't know. So I'm always, as I'm scrolling day to day or whatever, I just go past these videos or these pictures of just stuff that I'm like, okay, the world is a different place than what I thought.
Absolutely.
Right?
Very much so.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That Noah movie was wild.
I've gone back and watched it since I learned about all this stuff, and I'm like, oh, I've really appreciated it since then.
I just found it, I don't know. It wasn't that I hated it. It just was like, there was sometimes the CGI or the graphics bothered me, but
that's fair.
Neither here nor there. But it just was weird.
Yeah.
Like it was just, and here's the thing: some people get really upset when art goes outside of the biblical lines.
Yep.
Which is hard not to do because the biblical lines are pretty narrow. Like there's
Well,
not
a short story.
there's not a whole lot written, right?
Yeah.
So
I feel like at some point we should do an Inverted Orthodoxy Reacts series, and we should watch something like a Noah, or just like react to things.
That might not be a bad thing. But I don't have a problem, and this is a personal thing, when somebody takes artistic license with the biblical stories. Mm-hmm. Like that's what they're doing. You have to know. Well, you should realize that's what they're doing.
That's what the New Testament authors are doing with the Old Testament all the time.
Oh, totally.
But like people are upset with The Chosen because they've taken some, but they're not saying this is scripture. Yeah. They're saying we are creating a story about the life of Jesus from what we know, and we are making something that is fiction.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You can read any one of the Gospels in an hour and a bit at the most.
Yeah.
And they represent, at the very least, 3+ years of Jesus' life.
Yeah, we don't even get much dialogue or anything, right?
Acts is like 40 years.
Yeah.
Yes. And we read it.
You can read all of the Gospels in an afternoon.
Yep.
And there's a lot of overlap in the Gospels.
Yep.
And the major focus of all the Gospels is the Passion Week.
Yeah.
And so, yes, when John says at the end of the book of John, like, if you tried to write all of the things that Jesus did, I don't think the world could contain all the parchments.
Yep.
Right? Like, John lived it.
Yep.
He watched it. He saw it. Yep. Like, the number of the miraculous things that Jesus probably did, like, he would have, if you could sit down with him in his lifetime, he would have had story after story after story after story forever. Yep. Like, that's what it would have been like for him, or the teaching, or this one time when Jesus said this, or had this interaction with people. And those Gospels that we have, like, they're just such a small fraction of what it is that Jesus actually lived on this earth.
Yep.
That those authors decided, this is what I need to include in my telling of what matters of the story. Yeah. And that's great. But we should just be like, it's okay. And I guess to speak to the art is to speak to the fact that the Bible wasn't written in a vacuum, is to say, like, let's just not be so afraid. Mm-hmm.
I did appreciate about that Noah movie. I remember the one thing that struck me was the wrestling that the character Noah had to go through. Mm-hmm. And I've said this to many people, compared to my flannel graph Noah that I learned about in Sunday school, who's just this happy guy with a hammer, just like building an ark, right? And everything was good. Yeah. I was like, I think that depicts, like the movie depicts real life a little bit more than my flannel graph did.
Right? Up there sitting in his boat praying to God while bodies float by. Yeah, might have been an interesting tension of this God.
There was probably a lot more tension going on. He still had a wife, he still had kids, he still had neighbors.
Yeah. All the animals now to look after.
Yeah.
Well, I always think about his sons' wives who are saved, because their families all died.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like, assuming you believe in the historicity of the story, like, there's a lot of tension there that we don't even think about.
Yep. So we've definitely rabbit trailed, but
don't worry about the rest of the people.
The rabbit trail is long with the Nephilim.
That is correct.
Yeah. All right, next question.
Oh, can I just say, I'd recommend anything. You mentioned Michael Heiser. I'd recommend anything by Michael Heiser except his fiction. He's got a couple of fiction.
You beat me to it. I never read the fiction books.
I only read one. There were two. I read one. I didn't read the second one. It just, if you want to read it, go ahead. It was not.
His Naked Theology podcast is wonderful. There's lots.
His fiction was just
I have not read his fiction.
Good.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Just Michael in heaven listening maybe to this podcast.
Did God make a mistake when he made people intersex? Because if God created man and woman, what is to be said about people who are born this way?
This is a beautiful, challenging question that I appreciate the person who's asking it asking. I think it speaks to the tension that we live in the 21st century when we recognize Scripture where God speaks to Jeremiah and says, before you were, I knitted you together. I called you in your mother's womb. In Psalm 139, before I was knitted together in my mother's womb, you knew me. Yeah. This idea of God foreknowing, of God being there in the act of inception and God helping to knit together. Yeah. And the 21st century knowledge that a male and a female come together and the science behind the chromosomes and all of that and the reality of the fact that the sperm and the egg connect, and there is the formation of a life from a scientific point of view that Scripture cannot speak to, but that we recognize as valid.
Yep.
And so there is always a tension there. And so I want to answer this question in a very respectful and very humble way of trying to hold both of those.
Yeah.
Because did God make a mistake when he made people intersex?
Yeah.
Well, scripturally, God only made two people. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, there's an inherent assumption there.
Yes. Yeah. That God is making each person, but there's also a very natural method that people are made that we all know through the human act of sex that causes humanity to be formed.
Yep.
And where and how is God in all of that?
Yeah.
This is something we all have to wrestle with, and this is something we all have to figure out how we're going to hold both of these things at the same time.
Yep. And also, you jumping in, Blake?
Well, I was going to say, and to me, it leads to, a broader question of what is perfection, what is brokenness, right? What did Adam and Eve look like if there are, our perfection, if we believe that's what God made perfect? Because there's a lot of what we would call in our 21st century deformities that come from natural childbirth, right? Many people are born differently than what we describe as the norm or what maybe someone would hold up as perfect. And then we're left deciding what that is. Like, what is perfection? What is an abnormal or a deformity? What is not good, right? Like, just because someone is born with a deformity or a difference in what we would think is not norm, would that be outside? If you're giving God control over this, is that outside of what God would see as good, right? Like we make a lot of assumptions.
And did God miss that one?
Yeah.
Totally. Is there a mistake? Is this the result of sinfulness or brokenness in the world? Is it, we know obviously that drugs, diseases, all these things can cause defects in childbirth. Like, we know that, right? Does God allow that? Does he not allow that?
Or did God cause the parent to drink to be able to cause that?
Totally. Yeah.
There's mental, so many different implications.
Disabilities, holy, it gets big and big and big, right? But it's a good question. It's one that I believe we as believers should wrestle with. And wrestle with more so than just, I guess I'm speaking to myself, naivety, right? Just being like, well, that's perfection. That's the way it's supposed to be. Everybody else is junk.
Yeah,
that's not okay, right? That's not a right way of thinking. Yeah. There's a lot of people that I know that have defects or deformities or mental disabilities or whatever they're born with that have beautiful lives.
Yeah,
Did God miss on that? I don't know, right?
I think there's a couple things I'll I'll judge it from where I stand theologically. Just Doug, you said God only made two people, and Blake, you said God made two people in perfection. I would personally take even difference with both those assumptions.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm assuming a literal interpretation of the creation account. And so, stating that only to say that's the only way you come up with God literally creating two people. I'm not saying that's what I think. Yeah. I'm saying at most.
Yeah. And I just want to take those statements that have been made and say even I would even take 10 difference with those, like even Adam and Eve in perfection. God never states I made them perfect.
Right.
I made them
that's
good.
Our assumption. That's what I was questioning.
Right. And so I don't even hold that. And even where the Adam and Eve story is true or mythological and archetypal for us to be able to play with. That's a whole nother set of questions. But even then the Jeremiah and the Psalm, I knew you in your mother's womb and I formed you, is that language of through what process and mechanism? Like, is that by God holding all of creation together, these mechanisms for childbirth to take place, to be made, is absolutely God making. Is it him intricately putting somebody together? And so the assumption I see inherent in this question, did God make a mistake, is assuming that God is physically placing every person together versus sustaining the mechanism by which things can be created. And that's a very big difference, because then it makes God intentionally doing all these things, the disabilities that you've addressed. I often will take things and play them out to an extreme and then go, does this still hold true? And if so, then we can reverse it back to where we stand. So to take this to an assumption, to press pause on the conversation around intersex. And then we say a child with some form of severe physical limitation that cause and with that pain and suffering with it. Then we have to assume God is the author and creator and intender of that pain, suffering, and even a kid who lasts only a short while, only ever in pain. That is not the God that we see, who is the giver and sustainer of life.
See, and I push back on you, and I have before.
Yeah.
And I'm okay with that. Like but I love this for inverted orthodoxy.
Yeah.
Because I agree with you. That's a harsh thing to think about God, that God would intricately make somebody like that, which would seem like a mistake to us, and then they pain, suffering, die, right?
Yep.
That seems awful. But if you and I'll let you explain more what you believe about that. Yep. But if I back up that theology, then go, okay, God doesn't do that. That is a result of people doing it.
Yeah.
I still believe in a God, and maybe this is where I don't know if our theology beats there, Kyle, but
that's okay.
I still believe in a God who at some point started the process.
Yep.
So to me, he's still on the hook anyways.
Right.
Like whether he made that person pain and suffering, and I have to accept that, or he just allowed that into the world and people are the result of that, making the pain and suffering, whatever.
You're skipping one part there.
Okay,
the major part that humans have brought all the consequences of sin and suffering and brokenness into the world, and God's intention was goodness and to restore that at all times.
Yes.
And so for now, it is our collective contribution and sustaining of sin in the world that then has implications on everybody. I'll use another example that's unrelated from the birth one. Right now, argue all day long, back and forth on it, but humans' contribution towards global warming, if it is minor, major, or of any effect.
Climate change.
Climate change,
Use
period.
Climate change. Yep. I hear less and less about global warming and more about climate change, which is what it is.
Yeah, and so the impacts of that are felt most around those cultures and places around the equator, and not in the northern and southern hemisphere extremes like Canada. So we are then, by our actions, causing ripple effects that are affecting somebody else that we won't feel nearly as much. And I think the same way sin is inhabiting itself within the world in all forms. It is not to say the parents of somebody did something wrong sinfully, and this is right within Jesus' story of the man born blind. There's even a tension there. Did they sin so bad that their child has to suffer from it? I don't think that's the case. I think the world in which we all are inhabiting, the sinfulness is causing brokenness from physical disability to mental capacities that are limited and affected. Some directly, like somebody with FAS passed along because the parents chose to act in an unhealthy way towards those children, but that is not always every kid that's born with any level of disability. And so when it comes to then, now we grounded in a conversation around sex and sexuality and sexual identity. I do not believe God is forming every child, and therefore intersex people are not born because God has designated to make them such, any more than somebody born with a physical or a mental limitation. That does not, though, stop my God who will redeem every story that we is invited into. And so, yes, there are beautiful. Some of my favorite people that I've ever got the chance to be around are people with Down syndrome. They are living the fullness of life at all times. Yeah. Everything's awesome. That's easy for me to say as somebody who's not having to parent a kid through that. But my time with people with Down syndrome has been of the utmost joy. And they are just full of that. And God redeems that because of who he is and brings wonderful stories of my wife in nursing has seen people suffering through cancer with much joy and peace that is not a part of this world. I do not think that is God making those stories happen for that, but that is God interrupting and intervening and redeeming stories of where our brokenness and sinfulness is having impact, and he's showing just a glimmer of what full redemption is going to be on one end. And so there's a real need for the church to wrestle with what it means for disability within the church, period, and how we are hospitable towards those people and care for them, and then have a theology around it for God's redemptive nature, so that one day we also can have hope. It will all be redeemed. But for somebody to have to struggle with gender identity as a result of being born intersex, I don't believe was God's plan. For from the beginning, it was male and female that God designated us.
I think it's important to recognize intersex does not just speak to people who are born with gender identity issues.
No.
There's also people who are born intersex physically.
And that's what this term generally means, but I know it leans to it.
I was not reading it as in gender identity issues. I was reading it people born with
I was lumping that in.
Physically intersex.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think inherent... The problem in this question for me is it overlooks sin, as you've already addressed. It overlooks, and I think that's the part that you were missing in what you said, was it misses the effect of humans' choices, not always directly, indirectly, and just the brokenness that exists in this world. This question hits me personally because of my son, Jaden. When he was in utero, at some point, some of the cells in his body stopped developing, a small portion of them, and then just went into stasis and stayed there until he was 3, and then started growing again. But when they started growing again, they were cancerous, and that was what eventually took his life. Right? Did God make a mistake there? No, I agree with you, Kyle. God is not the one. Like when two people have sex, and the sperm and the egg connect. That's not like this moment where nothing else happens naturally, and God like steps in and starts knitting a body together. Right? God is sustaining the process by which we have the opportunity to join him in redemption. Yes, in Christ all things are held together. I believe that divine mystery, even as I don't understand it. And even as I look at what's going on in the world, and I think there are many things that Christ is holding together that break his heart, which is an astounding thing to think about, as he desires to bring redemption in every aspect of our world. And so I guess I look at it and I'm like, if you look at the story of the disciples asking Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And I'm not in any way implying that the person who asked this question asked with any sort of bad attitude.
No,
I think it's probably a genuine question. But I think it's easy for us to have a question, whether the disciples' question it at least implies, when I read it, the possibility of self-righteousness. Right? Either he sinned or his parents sinned that he was born blind. Implied in that is, well, neither me nor my parents did because I'm not. Right? And it's easy if we're not going to puff ourselves up with self-righteousness, which I'm not accusing this person of, then the only other place to go if we don't account for sin and humanity's role in general is then God.
Yep.
Right? But there is a general we, and the older I get, the more I realize we are far more interconnected than we care to think.
Yep.
And there is a global aspect of our actions collectively as a humanity that can lead to more brokenness or can lead to more healing and wholeness. And I don't just mean that in practical ways. The older I get, the more convinced I am that I mean that in also spiritual ways. Like the Bible talks about how your sin impacts the land.
Yep.
Well, and the older I get, the more I look at the world around me, the more I pray, the more I try to have my worldview formed by the wisdom of Scripture, the wisdom of God revealed in Scripture, the way of Jesus, the more I go, I can see that.
Yep.
I can see that there could be a place of when people are seeking God and seeking redemption, that the land itself, everything around them becomes blessed.
Yep.
And that we can also put ourselves under a place of cursing that doesn't just affect us, but affects the world around us as well. We have far more impact than I think we like to think. But I would also, after having said all of that, I do think it's important for us to realize no one we've ever met was born perfectly the way God intended.
Correct.
You know, think of the most handsome person you know.
What?
Brad Pitt, right? Or George Clooney, or whoever you think that is. Think of the most beautiful woman you can think of. And you're like, that, like you say, like that is perfection, right? No person was born perfect.
Yep.
We all carry the mark, the impact of that sin in our souls and sometimes in our bodies. And I think that is original sin. We turned original sin into this, you know, that baby, and I heard somebody talking about this a while back. They were talking about they talked about when they had a baby, they were sitting with this newborn.
Yep.
And some person came over and was like, you know, that newborn, we're all like oohing and on over this cute little baby. You know, they're a totally deprived human being, right, who's going to hell if they don't accept Jesus. And I'm like,
no way.
Yeah, they were telling me this story. And I was like, did you punch that person and just be like, shut up, this is my kid, like, just leave me alone. Like, we can get this caricature version of original sin.
Yeah.
But it is the deformity of our soul for all of us that is going to impact our lives. Yeah. It is the limitations that we're born with, the weaknesses we are born with. And sometimes those can be physical, and that's got nothing to do with any sort of God rolling the dice and this person getting the short end of the stick.
Yep.
But just the reality of humanity living as we have lived and the brokenness that has resulted.
Yeah. That kind of theology is so important to wrestle with, and I think then is the avenue to the church being the hope for God to work into this world when we wrestle with this. To take this to another extreme for the sake of it, if we can assume there are people who are mistakes or lesser than by God's standards, and that was something he intended, that has led to all sorts of bad expression of church within the world.
Yeah, when we dehumanize someone,
separating
then
by
we
race,
can do whatever we want to do.
Hitler's language around certain people with disability and all that need to be literally murdered because they are lesser than.
Closer to home, the Canadian
with indigenous
communities,
schools.
right? Totally. Yeah. The minute the church allows that there is a hierarchy within creation because God intended it and we got onto the top of the list, that actually allows the church to use the power of the world against the rest of the world thinking we are righteous. Yeah. When we can look at a problem, let me change that language. When we can look at the world and realize there is complexity and nuance and brokenness within all of us, the church then has a desire to be a mechanism for change and hospitality. So then we can go, somebody with right now the church and a lot of its expression in North America is not sensitive toward somebody born with intersex as the culture war of gender identity spheres. And that's why I did bring those terms into together. And so we can make an argument quickly in those spheres of like, well, then you're just not a part of it until you get on board with us. You're out. Versus an idea of we have to realize there's brokenness within all of us. Mm-hmm. And so there's places where somebody born with a learning disability, we need to then be, as the church, the ones that work hard to help educate and make space for and financial support and care for those people, physical limitations, to access God by his community within churches. We should be the ones advocating for accessibility to our buildings. Like, there should be all these changes because we see there is need for hospitality of God who came to us. We then come to others until Jesus is able to fully restore his kingdom to it being good, not perfect. That we can then be made whole in every way, shape, or form. We then are the ones who should aim most to be the ones reaching and wrestling with the questions of where those lines are and how we do that well within this world because of the hope and the extension that Jesus has given us first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good news.
Yeah.
And I was just reading the Beatitudes. I was doing it with young adults and just thinking through that list and just thinking how Jesus calls these people blessed, or we could call it lucky, or we could call it, there's good stuff coming, whatever you want to say. Yeah. He looks at the brokenness of the world and says, I'm coming. I'm Jesus. I can restore. Like, this is good news for you, right? So, I love that, Kyle. All right. Next question. Different direction altogether. In 1 Samuel 15, we were introduced to David. In 1 Samuel 16, David is introduced to Saul, and it's clear to Saul who David is and who his father is. In Samuel 17, verse 12, the author of 1 Samuel introduces David to us again as though he was never introduced in chapter 15. In 1 Samuel 17, 55 to 58, it seems as though Saul has no idea of who David is. What is going on here? It feels like 1 Samuel chapter 17 was an insert from another author added after the original book was written. That's a confusing thing to read. When you read that, you will see it.
It absolutely is, and it is weird. And to be completely honest, I did no research ahead of this question, and I don't know the answer off the top of my head. I do think that we think the Bible was written the way that we'd write a book today.
Yep.
We don't realize the oral stories handed down for generations that eventually got assembled into a narrative that was... that became the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so to go back to the Bema podcast, and if I had looked at this question ahead of time, maybe I'd have something more insightful. But one of the things that they talk about regularly is when you see something that seems weird, that's a point for reflection and introspection, and a point to look at that and try to understand why did they do this way. Because I have read that, and I'm like, that's weird.
Yes.
And I remember reading that years ago and being like, well, maybe like Saul just really didn't pay much attention to the guy who is, playing harp in his court, right?
That's true, and I'll answer that, or I'll agree with that. But because we've been brought up in the belief that the Bible is written correctly.
Yeah.
So I didn't blame the author. I'm like, what happened to Saul? Right?
But I just thought,
like,
if you're king, there's some guy playing the harp. You don't necessarily take a lot of time to be like, who are you and whose kid are you? I'd really like to know about you. When you're the king,
could be true.
Everybody's there for you. Yeah. So I thought that doesn't address the issue that the writer does introduce David a second time.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yep. So I will also say there's a few things here. Again, I would have loved to give some more time in preparation, just not naturally how we often operate with the podcast. There's a couple things. One, the way in which Saul meets David in 16, as I pull it up, it's while he's in the midst of his torment. And so he's struggling. I don't think he's paying attention to anybody, right? Maybe. As you've already addressed. Yeah. Like, he may not remember as a result of the mental state he was in that moment, who he was introduced to. It made mention early in the question.
And even in a good mental state, he would have met a lot of people, and he was the king.
As the king.
They're there for you.
Totally.
You probably aren't taking a lot of interest. And I think it's very conceivable that he could have been like, have we met?
Yeah.
Right? I always think of this story. Sorry to interrupt what you're saying.
Yeah.
Who is the baseball player who stole a lot of it? Ricky
Henderson.
Ricky Henderson. Late in his career. Now, he was going to be in the Hall of Fame. He's fantastic. He ended up for a brief time on the Blue Jays. When he was on the Blue Jays, he met John Olerud.
Okay.
John Olerud was a fantastic baseball player. But the thing that was unique about John Olerud was he had some sort of medical condition that required that he always wear a hard baseball hat.
Okay.
So you know how they wear a batting helmet, and then they go in the field, they wear the regular hat.
Yeah.
When he was in the field, he wore a hard hat because if a ball hit him in the head or something hit him in the head, it could have tremendously devastating consequences.
Yeah.
Ricky Henderson walks into the clubhouse and meets him and sees him wearing this hat. And he's like, oh, I used to play with a guy who wore a hat like that too. And John Olerud was like, yeah, it was me. Because they'd been on a team before, but Ricky Henderson was the superstar.
Right.
And he had no idea who this guy was, who was a former teammate.
Right.
So I say that I've always looked at that story and been like, it's quite possible that Saul was like, I'm sorry, who are you?
Yeah.
We've met before many times.
Totally. Yeah, been there, done that.
Yeah, could have been.
Another one is jumping off the mention here that you had of it's clear that Saul introduced Saul. It's clear that Saul knew who David was and who his father is. I think there's a miss there because reading in 16, yes, it is referenced that who David's father is, but he may not know David of the, what was it, 11 boys, 12?
8.
8? There you go. There's a lot of kids.
Wasn't there 7? And then he looks at all of them?
Yep. There you go. I knew that was the story, that I knew there were a lot of boys, let alone girls potentially in there that are just not mentioned. So he mentions Jesse, does not mention all the kids. The the kingdom of Israel, we think of as millions of people, would not have been that large. And so to make mention of Jesse, one of the patriarchs in the area, especially the geographic area around where Saul is, would not have been as large as we often assume with a kingdom. So to be able to make mention of Jesse without knowing his kids would have been pretty normative. And then last, yes, as Doug mentioned, we assume the Bible has come to us and was written like we write a book today. I'd even maybe challenge it of like, we get a book and we assume it was this easy process of sit down and type it from beginning to end. And we forget the process of editing and rewriting and restarting and books that have been left in their wake and deleted files because they just never took off. Mm-hmm. The Bible has come to us not only in a very painful process of writing what it was, but a process of editing and reforming and all that from generation to generation. So absolutely has been an editing process by the time we receive the product that we have today that we call the Bible, through the process that I trust the Holy Spirit has been orchestrating as well amongst the people. Yep. And that's an important caveat to add, but there have been edits that have been made to the Bible. I don't know if I sit on it, but the whole Torah, there's a theory of there were actually 5 different authors and books that have been strung together well by a later set of editors that is highly favored by a lot of scholars. And so I don't think that would be unique to Samuel and 1st and 2nd Samuel, nor 1st and 2nd Kings. And then again, that process happens again when we get 1st and 2nd Chronicles that conflicts with both of those other 4 books. Like there's this beautiful process that we often forget about in reading our Bible. And so, yes, it very much is possible. This is exactly an insert from another author added to the book later.
And that's where, for the Bema podcast, when they talk about when you see these things that don't make sense, spend some time chewing on that, investigating that, researching that to try and find out. Because I'll go back to that season 1 through the Pentateuch, where they uncover some incredibly beautiful things from going to the Midrash and looking at Jewish thinking, and just uncover some beautiful parts that we would read over quickly and not think of. Yeah. But they're unpacking different things and saying everything in Scripture is in there for a reason.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll add, we have no idea the amount of time between chapter 16 and 17. Paul's torment, and David hears in his court and playing music. And then at 17 just starts. The Philistines gathered their camps for battle, and they were gathered. There could be years there. And so David was this, as he's described, this ruddy boy who was musical and playing an instrument. And then now, however many years potentially later, he's a grown enough man, like at least the very least older teenager, as he comes to the story of the Philistines and he enters into battle and kills Goliath. You just have an entirely different view of this kid, little tiny kid playing an instrument, and now a kid who just killed a giant. You're just looking at that person with a different set of eyes that I don't even recognize who this person is. It's a very natural human thing. So even could just be introduced for us in a narration to see Saul's transition of who he sees David to be, interrupted in his even lack of recognition of this person he's already met before.
Yeah, and we've all been there.
Totally.
We don't have to be famous to have met somebody, but not remember them.
Yep.
And then you meet them for a second time and you're like,
in a whole different state or a series of life. Yeah.
No, sometimes in Airdrie. Come on.
Sometimes right in the lobby of our church.
It's happened.
Yeah.
I probably I will confess it has happened to me.
No doubt.
That like there was one time I ran into somebody in the grocery store.
Yeah.
And we chatted for a few minutes and then we walked away. And I was with my daughter, Megan, who at the time was like 13 or 14.
Yeah.
And as we're walking away, she said, "You have no idea who that is, do you?" And I said, "I don't."
Yeah.
She said, "I could tell." Yeah. And they were like, "Pastor Doug." And they came over and
Yeah.
I was like, I didn't say anything. I like just engaged with them. Hey, yeah.
Yeah.
But I had no idea. But
Yeah.
clearly they remembered me.
Yeah.
I remember that day. It kind of hurt my feelings a little bit. But
Well played. Well played.
awesome.
Well, I'm sorry, all right? What's your name again?
That's so funny. Well done.
Awesome. We do need that time machine that you mentioned earlier because that would help us with some of these questions. We could go back and we could give more insightful thoughts. But thanks again for joining us for this episode of Inverted Orthodoxy Podcast. We enjoyed the journey and hopefully you did too as we talked about faith and just the intricacies to that. If you want to ask more questions, please jump onto our website, invertedorthodoxy.com, and submit your questions. And then wherever you listen or watch this podcast, please rate and review us and give us some likes. We will see you again.
See you guys.
See you.